What if the person the world throws away becomes the very reason someone else learns how to live again? The snow came down hard that morning, falling from the sky like feathers torn from a giant bird. The wagon moved slowly through the thick white road, its wheels sinking into the cold slush. Inside the wagon sat Anelise Warren, shivering under a thin shawl that did almost nothing to keep her warm. Her fingers were stiff, her cheeks numb, and her heart felt like it was sinking deeper with every mile. Her stepmother, Martha Warren, sat beside her, stiff and sharp, not touched by the cold at all. Martha's voice cut through the air like a knife. She leaned close and hissed, "Don't look at me like that. You should be grateful someone is even willing to take you." Anelise lowered her eyes quickly. Grateful. That was the word Martha liked to use. Be grateful you are being sent away. Be grateful you are being traded like an old mule. Be grateful someone else will have to deal with you now. She stared at her cracked hands. She had been called useless so many times, she had almost started believing it. The wagon hit a bump and shook the whole way through. Jedediah Boone, the trader driving the wagon, shouted to the horses. He was rough in voice and face, but there was kindness in the way he handled the reins. His wife, Abigail, had quietly slipped a small food basket into Anelise's hands that morning, a piece of bread, a slice of salted pork, and a tiny flask of tea. "Keep it close, girl," Abigail had whispered. "Not everyone is born with kindness around them. Sometimes you gotta carry it yourself." The road climbed higher into the mountains, where tall pines stood like silent guards. The air grew colder, sharper. After hours of climbing, they finally reached a cabin tucked against a rocky ridge. Smoke rose from its chimney in a steady line, warm and welcoming compared to the brutal cold all around them. Jedediah pulled the reins tight and turned to Anelise. "This is where your road ends, miss," he said gently. Anelise felt her heart thump hard in her chest. "And his name?" she whispered. "Thorne Callan," Jedediah answered. "Mountain man. Lives alone. Folks say he's half ghost, half legend. But he ain't cruel. Not unless someone gives him reason." Before she could gather her courage, Martha climbed down from the wagon, brushing snow off her skirt. Her voice rang out sharply. "Thorne, I brought what you paid for." The cabin door opened, and out stepped a tall man with broad shoulders and a fur-lined coat. His beard was touched with snowflakes, and his eyes were pale gray like winter storms trapped in human shape. Thorne Callan looked at Martha, then at Jedediah, and finally at Anelise. He said nothing. Martha crossed her arms. "You said you needed someone for the winter." "She can cook and clean. She won't be trouble." Thorne's eyes lingered on Anelise a moment longer, steady and unreadable. Then he reached into his coat, pulled out a leather pouch, and tossed it to Martha. "There's your coin," he said. Martha caught it with greedy hands, smiled, and turned away. She climbed back into the wagon. "Good riddance," she muttered before snapping the reins and heading down the mountain without a single backward look. Jedediah stayed only a moment longer. He adjusted his hat and looked at Anelise with soft eyes. "You'll be all right," he said. "He's rough, but not cruel. Sometimes that's all a woman can ask for." Then he too rode away, leaving her standing in the snow with nothing but her bundle and her fear. Thorne finally spoke. His voice was low and deep, like distant thunder rolling across the cliffs. "You can come inside." Anelise followed him into the cabin. Warm pine and smoke filled the air. A fire glowed in the hearth, and a kettle steamed beside it. The cabin was small but strong. A table, 2 chairs, shelves, tools, and a bed of furs in the corner. "You sleep there," Thorne said. "Cook if you can. I work the traps most days. You don't need to speak unless you've got something worth saying." Anelise swallowed hard and nodded. "Yes, sir." He turned his head slightly. "Don't call me sir. Call me Thorne." They stayed quiet for a long time. The fire cracked softly while the wind beat against the cabin walls. Anelise stayed near the door, unsure if she should move. Her shoes were soaked through from the snow. Thorne walked over and pulled a blanket from a chest. He handed it to her without meeting her eyes. "Warm up before you catch your death," he said simply. She held the blanket close. "Thank you." He set a plate in front of her. Bread, beans, and a bit of venison. The smell made her eyes sting with tears she didn't want to show. When she finished eating, she looked up quietly. "Why did you take me?" she asked. Thorne's gray eyes flicked toward her, then back to the fire. "Winter's long," he said. "Cabin gets quiet." He paused, then added even softer, "Guess I needed someone to share the silence." His answer felt simple, but it carried something deep she couldn't name. She didn't ask more. She didn't need to. That night she lay on her bed of furs, the fire flickering across the wooden walls. She had expected cruelty. She had expected to be treated like something bought and owned. Instead, she had found a man who spoke little, worked hard, and had offered her warmth without asking anything in return. For the first time in over a year, something inside her whispered that maybe her story wasn't over yet. Maybe she wasn't useless after all. The days slipped into weeks, and winter pushed hard against the mountains. The cabin that once felt hollow now carried the warm echo of daily life. Each morning, Anelise rose before dawn to light the fire and prepare coffee the way Thorne liked it. She learned his habits quietly. He preferred his boots by the door, his tools organized in straight lines, and his coffee strong enough to wake a bear from deep sleep. At first, Thorne barely spoke. He would step out before sunrise with his rifle and return after dark with whatever he caught. Sometimes a rabbit, sometimes nothing. But he always brought firewood, and he always set a small something on the table for her. A few berries, a smooth river stone, a scrap of cloth he thought she might use. He never explained his reasons, and she never questioned them. One morning, while gentle snowflakes drifted across the window, Anelise watched Thorne outside splitting logs. He wasn't wearing a coat, and steam rose from his skin as he swung the axe. His strength looked effortless, steady, and calm. When he stepped inside again, she quickly looked away from the window, pretending to be busy with breakfast. He noticed. "You can look if you want," he said in his plain voice. "I don't mind." Anelise froze for a moment. "I was only checking you didn't freeze out there." Thorne grunted, pouring himself coffee. Been colder years. But there was the hint of a smile tugging at his lips. That night she sat near the fire, sewing a tear in her skirt. The firelight made the place feel soft, almost safe. She lifted her eyes to him. "Why do you live up here alone?" she asked gently. Thorne sat at the table, sharpening his knife. The metal glinted with each stroke. He looked at the blade for a long moment before speaking. "People talk too much down there. Too many lies. Too many graves." Anelise tilted her head. "So you came here to forget?" Quote. Thorne stared into the flames, his voice low. "No, I came here to remember without anyone telling me how I should feel about it." There was pain in his words, the kind that came from love lost too soon. Anelise didn't push for more. Some wounds didn't need to be reopened to be understood. As winter stretched on, their silence grew calmer. Softer. Thorne built her a stool so she could reach the shelves. She patched his coat when it tore in the woods. They didn't speak much, but every small act carried meaning. One afternoon, Thorne returned from town with a sack of flour and something new in his eyes. "The creek's thawing," he said. "Water's running again. I could show you where I fish if you want to walk." A walk. Together. Anelise hesitated only a moment before nodding. "I'd like that." The forest was quiet and full of melting snow. The sun warmed the ground just enough to make the air smell like pine and wet earth. The creek sparkled ahead like a ribbon of silver. Thorne stood beside her as she stepped over a fallen log. He reached out, steadying her with his hand. For the first time, she felt his touch, gentle, strong. "I'm not breaking," she whispered with a shy smile. His voice softened. "Didn't say you were." They sat by the creek in peaceful silence. For the first time since she arrived, she felt like the world wasn't closing in on her. When she slipped her hand into the cold water, she whispered, "It's beautiful." Thorne nodded. "I used to bring my wife here." Anelise turned toward him sharply. He rarely spoke about his past. "Your wife?" He nodded, his eyes far away. "Long time ago. Fever took her and the boy before winter. buried them up the ridge. His voice barely cracked, but the pain lived quietly beneath every word. Anelise felt tears burn behind her eyes. She slowly placed her hand over his. He didn't pull away. They sat like that, until the sun dipped low and the shadows stretched long. On the walk back, their silence was no longer empty. It was full of something fragile and new. Weeks later, the quiet peace was broken by a shadow crossing the cabin door. Sheriff Eli Carter rode up on horseback, dusting off snow as he climbed down. Thorne stepped out, rifle in hand. "Easy," the sheriff said with a half-smile. "I'm not here to bother you." Thorne lowered the gun, but didn't relax. "Then speak." The sheriff glanced at Anelise standing in the doorway. "Word from down valley. Folks say she ran off with a stranger. They claim she owes them money." "That's not true," Anelise said, her voice shaking. "They sold me like an animal." "I figured as much," Eli said. "Don't worry, I'm not here to take you back." "Just thought you should know what's being said." Thorne's jaw flexed. "If they come looking for her, they find me first." Eli nodded slowly. "That's what I expected you'd say." He tipped his hat to Anelise. "You're safe here, miss." When he rode away, Anelise looked at Thorne with trembling hands. "You didn't have to stand up for me." Thorne stepped closer, his eyes steady. "Yes, I did." She swallowed. "Why?" Thorne's voice dropped low, warm like the fire behind him. "Because nobody should have to beg for a place to belong." Her breath caught. "And what if I already found mine?" For a moment, he said nothing. Then, with quiet honesty, he whispered, "Then, I reckon I did too." The night settled around them, warm and alive. For the first time, the silence between them felt like a promise. Spring came slowly to the mountains. The snow melted from the roof in long, glistening drops, and the sharp wind softened into a cool breeze that carried the scent of pine and blooming wildflowers. Anelise felt a new kind of warmth growing in her chest, something she had never known before. Safety, hope, belonging. Thorne Callan, the man who once lived like a ghost in a lonely cabin, seemed to come back to life with the land. He spoke more each day. He lingered by the fire instead of hiding behind his silence. Sometimes he would hum while carving wood, and sometimes Anelise would join him, her gentle voice blending with his low one. They were building a life without needing to say it out loud. One morning, Thorne saddled his horse earlier than usual. The sky was pale and clear, and the ground glistened with fresh dew. "I'm riding into town," he said, tightening the straps. "For supplies?" Anelise asked as she kneaded dough at the table. He nodded, but something in his eyes flicked away from hers. "Something like that." "Do you want me to come with you?" she asked softly. He hesitated, then shook his head. "Better you stay here." "I won't be long." She watched him ride away down the narrow trail. The air felt different after he left. Too quiet, too empty. She tried to sew, tried to clean, but nothing settled her heart. Night fell, and Thorne still hadn't returned. The wind howled as if warning her. The fire popped sharply, shadows jumping across the log walls. She paced, then forced herself to sit, then stood again with trembling hands. Just before midnight, hooves thundered against the frozen ground. Anelise rushed to the door and flung it open. Thorne stumbled inside, soaked through from rain and half frozen. He held a small leather-wrapped bundle tight to his chest. "Thorne," she cried, "you're frozen. What happened?" Quote? He gave a faint smile, water dripping from his hat. "Had to be sure I got back before you started worrying." She frowned, her voice soft. "I already was." Thorne laid the bundle on the table and unwrapped it carefully. Inside was a piece of fine blue fabric and a small gold ring resting on top. Anelise gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Thorne cleared his throat, suddenly nervous in a way she had never seen. "I went to see Sheriff Eli Carter," he said. "Got him to write a paper saying you're free from anything they claim you owe. Nobody can drag you back. Nobody can say you belong to them." Her eyes filled with tears. Thorne. But he wasn't finished. He picked up the ring, his big calloused hand trembling just a little. Then he dropped to one knee. "Anelise Warren," he said in a rough, shaking voice. "You've patched my coat, warmed this cabin, and brought my soul back from the cold. I'm not a rich man. I'm hardly a proper one. But if you'll stay, I'd like to build more than a home with you. I'd like to build a life." Her breath broke. "Are you asking me to marry you?" Quote. He nodded. "To be my wife. Not because I need someone to cook or keep the fire burning, but because I can't imagine another day without hearing you in this place." Anelise's hands covered her trembling lips. "I was sold once," she whispered, "told I was useless, unwanted. And now you're asking me to choose to belong by my own will. No one's ever asked me that before." Thorne stood, still holding her hand. "I'll wait as long as you need, but I meant every word. You're not useless, Anelise. You're everything I didn't know I needed." Her tears finally broke free. She stepped into his arms, holding his face gently. "Yes, Thorne Callan," she whispered. "I'll be your wife." The next day, the valley seemed brighter than ever. The Boones came up the trail with flowers and fresh bread. Sheriff Carter rode up with his hat in hand to serve as their witness. Thorne wore his cleanest shirt, and Anelise wore the blue fabric he had brought from town, sewn into a simple dress that made her look like spring itself. The ceremony was held beside the creek under the tall oak tree, the same place where Thorne once came to remember his pain. Now he came to make new memories. When Sheriff Carter spoke the final words, Thorne lifted her hand and kissed it softly. "Welcome home, Mrs. Callan." Anelise smiled through her tears. "I've been home since the moment you opened your door." Years passed, and the story of the mountain man and the girl once called worthless spread across the valley. Travelers passing through would hear laughter echoing from the ridge, smoke curling from a chimney where a lonely cabin had once stood silent. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the mountains in a blaze of gold, Thorne wrapped his arm around Anelise as they stood outside the cabin they had built together. "You ever think about where we'd be if I hadn't stopped for that wagon?" he asked. Anelise leaned into him, smiling softly. "I think about it every day. You saved my life, Thorne." He shook his head gently. "No, you saved mine." The sky glowed orange and blue above them, and the world seemed to hold its breath. There were no grand speeches, no last promises, just the quiet truth of two broken hearts that had found each other. Where loneliness once lived, laughter now filled the air. Where a girl was once called useless, she became irreplaceable. Where a man once buried in grief lived in silence, he found a reason to breathe again. And in the wild heart of the mountain, love proved stronger than the snow, softer than sorrow, and brave enough to rebuild what life had once broken.